The projection of Putin as a reckless wrecker of the world order is something that is a creation of the Western media because it has also suited the Russia-West acrimony at various points of time. So Putin is now the Gabbar Singh of the world. But if you look at it, he's a man who is driven by wanting to make Russia great.
Hi, I'm Shoma Chaudhury. Thanks for watching Enquiry. As we manufacture Hindu-Muslim wars out of thin air in India, the world is actually poised for a real catastrophic war in Ukraine, where Russia, America, and Europe are in a face-off that's being described as the most dangerous since the Second World War and the Cold War. So how should one read President Putin? What is at stake here for everyone? Is the talk of war real? And how will it impact America, China, Russia, Europe, Ukraine, and India? In short, how will it reorder the world? To discuss all of this, I have a fantastic guest on the show today, Mr. P.S. Raghavan. Mr. Raghavan was India's ambassador to the Czech Republic, Ireland, and Russia, and he was the chairman of the National Security Advisory Board till last year. He's a seasoned diplomat with a lot of insight into Russia and the region, and it's a privilege to have him on the show. Thank you very much for joining me, Mr. Raghavan.
Thank you.
So, sir, the Ukraine crisis is being billed as the most serious crisis since the Cold War, and actually, if it does escalate into a full-blown war, then after the Second World War. But before we even go into all that is at stake, just now there's very mixed and confusing signals over whether there's a de-escalation or whether, with the exchange of shelling on the border, whether actually we are really at the brink of war. How do you read it?
There is so much rhetoric right now and so much of allegation and counter-allegation. It's impossible to know what the situation on the ground is. Now, about one small point about the shelling across the border. This shelling is not actually across the border between Russia and Ukraine. It is supposed to be within Ukraine in the region which the rebels, the so-called separatists, are controlling, and the Donbass, the Donbass and the Ukrainian forces. So it's across the contact line between the rebels and the Ukrainian forces. That's where the shelling is supposed to be. It's accompanied by all these allegations about false flag operations, and apparently the allegation is that the Russians are organizing it in order to create a pretext for invading and so on. But, actually, if you have to step back and look at what the situation is, if you want to commit a crime, you need the means and you need a motive. Now, the Russians have the means right now for the invasion, as everyone tells us, hundreds of thousands of troops and artillery and etc., etc., etc. The question is, what is the motive? And that is where, the narrative that war is imminent, it really sounds very weak because, if President Putin takes the decision to invade, he has actually lost whatever negotiating chips he has built up by the accumulation of forces on the border.
Right.
And I think if you do have a war, it's going to be that. I don't need to say it's going to be cataclysmic for all concerned. For the Russians, for the Americans, for Europe, and for us as well.
Right.
The consequences are really terrible. So if you look at it, therefore, rationally, there is no rational basis to expect a war. Now, of course, rationality doesn't always prevail because some hotheads may somewhere create a provocation, and because there is so much mistrust and suspicion, people may react, and it may actually happen, though it was not intended by either side. In fact, that's how the First World War, for example, broke out. People remember that. So this is where we are. I think there is a lot of brinkmanship involved. The idea is to try to get an outcome, which, if the two sides step back from the brink in good time, is achievable. And in fact, if you see the course of the negotiations that have taken place, or the signals that have been given out from both sides over the last few weeks, the basis for a face-saving settlement for both sides exists. It's a matter of when both sides get off their tigers, so to say, get off the backs of the tigers that they're riding,
Right.
and settle for it.
So, sir, before we come to the what you think are soluble paths forward, to really create a amicable settlement to this, you served in Russia as the ambassador, and you understand the psyche of that government. That with the NATO powers and with America and the EU saying that they would not send in forces to defend Ukraine if Russia invades Ukraine, and yet they are giving Ukraine, the dream of being a sovereign nation allied to the West, perhaps entry into the NATO, but they're not going to back it with forces. And Russia clearly wants to control Ukraine. It's very important to them strategically. So, how do you read Mr. Putin? Do you think that he would go in for this? Because Ukraine is very important, and when they annexed Crimea, nobody did anything about it,
Yeah. I think you have to start off with the premise that President Putin is a rational human being who is looking out for the national interests of his own country. I mean, this is something that very often gets lost in the narrative, in the media narrative in the West. But President Biden himself, after he met Mr. Putin, reaffirmed this, that, essentially is driven by national interests. Now, I was there in Moscow when this annexation of Crimea took place. It was 2014, and I was in Moscow at that time as ambassador. Now, the fact of the matter is that, everybody should have seen it coming, because Russia has signaled very clearly, and President Putin personally signaled to the American president at that time when talk of Ukraine joining NATO first arose, that, look, it is too important for us. Now, it's not a matter of controlling Ukraine, as you mentioned. Actually, what is important for them is the strategic position of Ukraine. Ukraine, lies on this North European plain, across which all invaders into Russia over the ages have actually come in. And this is there in the historical psyche. It is there in the psyche of the Russian nation, including Mr. Putin. So whether it is the Poles initially, the Swedes, and the Napoleon and Hitler, all of them over the centuries have come in through that. And, the border between Russia and Ukraine is so porous that once you cross that border, you can reach to Moscow without much obstructions in between, military obstructions. So this is one aspect of it, which is why Russia is very, very much keen to have Ukraine as a kind of a buffer state. So NATO in Ukraine and Ukraine in NATO is therefore actually a no-no for Russia. The other thing is Crimea. Now, Crimea itself is actually on the Black Sea, and it is the one port which Russia has, which is a warm water port, which gives Russia access to not only the Black Sea, but all through to the Mediterranean Sea as well. And now, if you want to be a great power, and Russia has tried to regain its status as a great power, you need to be able to project maritime power. Now, if you look at it, all the other ports that Russia has, they're not all-weather ports. They're frozen for much of the year and so on. So this is the Crimea, therefore, becomes Sevastopol, which is a port in Crimea, becomes a very important port for Russia to defend as a naval power and as a protection against invasion from outside.
Right.
Thirdly, if you look at Ukraine, actually, one whole half of Ukraine, east of the Dnieper River, is actually ethnoculturally Russian. Crimea, for example, is 90% Russian-speaking people.
Right.
And the Donbas region that we talk about is about 70% plus Russian-speaking. In fact, even a wider region beyond that. So there is this ethno-cultural affinity which Russia has as well, as Ukraine is part of the Soviet Union. So it's a complex of reasons why President Putin cannot give up Crimea. And what they have done really after the annexation of Crimea, these separatists, these rebels actually started asking for breaking away from Russia for independence. And of course, Russia supported them. There's no question of that. There was support from Russia, by which they actually occupied territory. And this area that you now know as Donbas is actually an area carved out of eastern Ukraine, which these people control. And the present, the Minsk agreements and all that people talk about are a method by which this area can be given a certain level of autonomy within a federation, within a federal Ukrainian constitution, which is still to be enacted.
So, sir, I'm going to come back to Russia's reasons and your understanding of Mr. Putin's rationale. Typically, the entire English-speaking world reads the Western press. So there's a kind of, tilt always to Western concerns. But so I just want to ask you a slightly prickly question, which is that, as you said, Russia is looking out for its own legitimate strategic concerns. And its demand that the NATO post-1997 has added 14 East European countries, which were part of earlier Soviet Union. And one element of NATO is that then if there's any conflict, then all the NATO forces would defend that country with armed forces, So again, is it somewhat irrational or irresponsible of the Western democracies to expand the NATO all the way to Ukraine and expect Russia not to be worried when NATO was constructed as a bloc against Russia during the Cold War? So is it a little irresponsible and irrational to insist on that?
See, in geopolitics and in international politics, I don't think we should talk about irresponsible or irrational. Countries do what they can do. Countries do what they can do and get away with, to put it very bluntly.
Right.
Now, we are talking about the post-Cold War situation. The post-Cold War situation, the Soviet Union was vanquished. The Soviet Union was broken up. Russia was a very weak society economically, politically, and socially. There were so many other movements within its social tensions within that country as well. So this was the time when the United States, which was the leader of NATO, saw the opportunity. And by the way, there were two reasons for expansion of NATO. Everyone talks about it as NATO expanding in order to reach Russia's borders. But one of the objectives, if you go back to President Clinton's and President Bush's presidency, the second President Bush, the idea was also to keep Europe. You see, once the Cold War was over, American control influence in Europe also became iffy because there was no enemy to bind you to America. And therefore, the expansion of NATO was as much because the Americans wanted to retain their influence over the expanded Europe and to sort of limit the move of Europe away from America. So that's also, that is not irrational or irresponsible. It's pure power politics. So there was the possibility of expanding Europe. Now, there was supposed to have been a verbal assurance given to Russia, to Gorbachev, that NATO would not expand. In real politics, in geopolitics, people do not bother about verbal assurances given at some point of time. So that's how it happened. And now, again, it is geopolitics playing up. There are two reasons why now this pushback is taking place. One is, you go back to President Biden meeting President Putin in June last year. Essentially, after years of acrimony, it was America that reached out its hand to Russia. And the idea was very clearly, President Biden explained it very clearly in his June press conference last year. He wanted to have a predictable and stable relationship with Russia so that America could focus on its other problems. And what are its other problems? Its domestic problems. Of course, the pandemic was there, the infrastructure was there, and some democratic challenges to democratic structure within the country was there. Externally, very clearly, Biden identified China as the principal strategic adversary of the US. And therefore, the idea was, let's have some kind of a modus vivendi with Russia, so that our we are not entangled in the European conflicts and the West Asian conflicts, all of which are a function of this US-Russia acrimony, and then focus on China. Now, this was the opportunity that Putin also got to push back, saying that, look, if you want a political compact with me, that we have a modus vivendi, and then I leave you free to deal with China, which, by the way, is good for me also, as Putin would, from Putin's perspective. Right. Because Putin also was finding Russia too dependent on China. So the idea then was that in that case, kindly ensure that you are not constantly snapping at my heels, at my periphery all over. So NATO advancing, the NATO advance had taken place, but also what has happened over a period of time is the placement of weaponry, very sophisticated weaponry, on the NATO countries in Russia's periphery, forcing Russia to also now have its own missiles. And America progressively during President Bush's time, they came out of the anti-ballistic missile treaty, and now President Trump came out of the intermediate range nuclear missile treaty, which means that and then of course the NATO has a missile shield, a missile defense program, where they have the anti-missile missiles all along the Russian periphery. Now, these days, a defensive missile can be converted into an offensive missile with very little notice. Right. So that's what President Putin is talking about. So essentially, if you therefore come to it, what are the demands that Russia has? Russia is essentially saying that, look, Ukraine and Georgia is equally important, by the way, which is also on Russia's periphery, should not join NATO.
But number two, Georgia, they already invaded in...
I'll come to the reason for the invasion also if you want. But essentially, Ukraine and Georgia should not join NATO.
Right.
But two, there were these Minsk agreements that were worked out in 2015 after the separatists moved pretty far into Ukraine. A ceasefire was brokered by France and Germany, and Russia is a party to that brokered arrangement that's called the Minsk Agreement. So Russia wants the Minsk agreements to be fulfilled in toto. And number three, it wants these security guarantees, that it wants some kind of an arrangement by which NATO missiles would move back to a certain distance away from Russia's periphery, in return for Russia's missiles moving back as well into its territory.
Okay.
Some kind of an agreement that, military exercises will be notified in advance, and there'll be some confidence building measures so that, there is some kind of an accepted, agreed framework of operation of the two forces. Right. So these are the three demands that Russia has. So the opportunity has come because the Americans actually extended their hand to Russia. That's why this has happened now.
So I just want to go one by one, since we're focusing on NATO, that, do you think, again, I'm not as equipped as you to stay so neutral in my language, so I may end up using value-based words. But what I'm trying to ask is that, would it not be advantageous, when one is in the brink of war like this, to accept that Ukraine will remain sovereign and like a buffer state, not aligned either to the West or to Russia, and that both sides agree on that, rather than the European and American powers insisting in this ambiguous way that, yes, membership can happen in the future. Right now, they're not giving it, but, leaving it in a gray area. Rather, would it not be more acceptable and plausible to declare that Ukraine remains sovereign, or is there really an impediment in doing that?
No, the problem with such assurances is that they're very difficult to either fulfill or monitor or guarantee. Because you can say today that Ukraine, yes, will remain sovereign and neutral. What happens tomorrow when a Ukrainian government changes and a US government changes and European government changes? Ukraine will say that it no longer suits my national interest to be neutral. So you can give assurances as much as you want, but in the real world, they don't work. So what are you looking at? What is Russia looking at? Actually, you must also understand that the demands that Russia has put forward and what President Putin has put forward and what the Russian delegation has put forward are maximalist. They're not going to get all that they asked for. And the idea is to move from there back to a fallback position that is acceptable. So, Russia says that you have to move all of NATO military infrastructure back from the countries that joined NATO after 1997. It's not going to happen.
Right.
They say we want an assurance that Ukraine will not join NATO. Cannot happen. Nobody will give you that assurance. It's not worth the paper it is written on, if it's written on any paper.
Right.
Because tomorrow things can change. So what do they want? See, already if you see, President Biden and even Olaf Scholz, when he was in Ukraine, said this, that the idea of Ukraine in NATO is not on the agenda. Practically, it cannot be on the agenda because Crimea is in the hands of Russia. Now, any country which has a disputed territory just cannot join NATO. Those are NATO's principles.
Right.
So they don't have to say that Ukraine will not join NATO. Ukraine does not have to say that I will not apply for NATO. As long as you
Definitely
let
not.
Russia occupy Crimea, Ukraine cannot be in NATO. The same with Georgia. There are these two republics, separatist republics of Georgia, which were created after the Russian war in 2008, which Russia has declared, accepted, recognized the independence of, and Russian troops are there. So as long as those separatist republics are separate, Georgia cannot become. So there is a solution there already. And assurance is not going to help any. Now, the other part of it is this Ukraine sovereign. You see, the Minsk agreements that we're talking about, where the Donbas region is given an autonomy, it does not impact on Ukraine's sovereignty. It basically impacts on Ukraine's structure. That instead of being a unitary system, it becomes a federal structure. Sort of, I mean, the nature of that federal structure has not been determined. That is still to be negotiated. But in whatever way, it will be a federal structure. That this part, the predominantly Russian-speaking part, will be autonomous to determine its own. See, because there is another issue there. When the new government took over in Ukraine in 2014, they actually banned the Russia as an official language. When you see, nearly half the country actually is Russian speaking.
Right.
So there are these issues. So this autonomy is supposed to be autonomy, preservation of Russian culture, Russian language, etc., etc. So that is what is now being talked about, that Minsk agreements, you implement them.
Right.
Ukraine does not want to implement them. Anyway, sorry, carry on.
No, that's great. I just wanted to go step by step so the audience stays with us.
Sure.
So now actually you've been bringing up the Minsk agreement. So that is being seen as the possible chip around which peace can be created. But that again is problematic. And from all that I've been reading, there's a lot of criticism about, the Western hand in designing that Minsk agreement, because it was hastily put together. It's open to massive interpretation. And so again, there's a kind of insoluble conflict there, which is that the way Russia interprets it would mean that Russia kind of has control over the Donbas. It would have veto powers, on the central government in Ukraine. And Ukraine is seeing it as, yes, it'll get integrated into Ukraine. It'll have autonomous powers, will be part of an overall federal structure. But I mean, basically, they're both interpreting it very differently. And I've been reading that at the heart of it lies, again, a question of control, that who will end. So how do you see it? Like, do you think it's been clumsily done, again, too ambiguous, or is it possible to create something feasible out of that?
No, let me say what has been clumsy about it is the reporting on the Minsk agreement, rather than the Minsk agreement itself.
Okay.
Of course, the Minsk agreement was a hastily drawn up agreement. And, why was that so? Actually, at that time, when the separatists started taking control over territory, they were moving at an alarmingly rapid pace towards the Dnieper River. And they were occupying a large amount of territory. The great danger that Ukraine saw, the West saw, was that they would take this city of Mariupol, which you may have seen on the map at various points of time. They were advancing toward Mariupol, and if they had taken Mariupol, which is on the sea as well, it would create a bridgehead for them to reach Crimea. So that would give, according to all the assessments at that time, Russia, through the separatists, a land bridge all the way from the Russian border up to Crimea, which would have been a major strategic advantage for Russia and a loss for Ukraine. So the Minsk agreements were actually brokered to stop this, to stop the rebels from reaching Mariupol, and to freeze the territory as it was in February 2015. That was the last of the Minsk Accord. Now, the Minsk Accord itself does not contain all that you mentioned about Russian control, etc., etc. It doesn't have any such thing. What does it say? It says, in fact, yesterday at the UN Security Council, the Russian ambassador read out each provision of the Minsk Accord, actually. It basically talks about ceasefire, of course, both sides moving back from the contact line, exchange of prisoners, etc., etc., etc. And then
elections.
Before that, the Ukrainian government will negotiate with the Donbas region people for the terms of the autonomy that they would like, and thereafter enact a constitutional change, recognizing the autonomous and defining the autonomy of the Donbas region. Thereafter, elections would be held. And thereafter, I mean, the bone of contention is that the Ukrainian forces can go into Donbass and to the Russian border only after the elections are held and the new local government is established in Donbass. This is what it is. Now, it doesn't need to be automatically Russian control over that region. Russian control will be in the form of Russian influence in this region in any case, because they're all Russian speaking.
Yeah.
Most of their trade and business is with Russia. So, their economy runs on Russia.
Right.
And so that is the Russian influence, but that you can say about, Indian influence in various areas and in our border as well, where you have, because of the ethnic links, the connections are great. So there is, in the Minsk Agreement, there's nothing about Russian control over that region. That is the way Ukraine sees it, however, because Ukraine does not want to yield even autonomy to this region, because it sees that autonomy means greater Russian influence on that region.
Yeah. No, and then it would have I thought it has a veto, because now Ukraine has written into its constitution that it will be aligned to the West, and it'll, that it's written that into its constitution. Whereas if it gives autonomy and they have a veto power, it would essentially weaken the Ukrainian central government.
There is no veto. There is no veto either explicitly or implicitly. There is no veto power of anybody there. And as far as alignment with the West goes, there is nothing that prevents Ukraine, along with this autonomous part, to be aligned with Europe. Now, alignment basically means what? It means two things. One is NATO, one is the European Union. NATO is no-go. That's not going to be possible. And in fact, in any agreement that will eventually be negotiated now, certainly the part of that agreement will be NATO military hardware will not be stationed in Ukraine. And by the way, NATO military hardware is not even today stationed in Ukraine.
Yeah, but in Poland and other areas, which are
those are NATO countries which are surrounding Russia, but they're not in Ukraine.
Yeah,
the maximum that is there in Ukraine are some NATO advisors are there who are advising the Ukrainian armed forces, and even they are not really under the NATO hat. They come under the hat of the countries which are really sending forces in. But again, in any confidence building agreement that comes up here, that will also be addressed, I think.
Right. So now just one more question on Putin before we move to China and India and America and how all this plays out for all of us. But, because you've served there, and as I said, you do have a understanding of both the leadership and the country, that, in the way Mr. Putin is interpreted by the West, do you see him as an expansionist leader that would have the, again, I'm using those words, recklessness to maybe enter a state of war? Also because everything that the West is threatening, of course, it's been saying that it won't send any military power to help Ukraine. It's been promising economic sanctions, but the last time it did that, apparently it only impacted 1 or 1.5% of Russia's GDP. And there's potential blowback for Europe and America on economic sanctions. Then Russia has huge energy resources, which impacts, almost 3/4 of Europe's energy comes from Russia. It's a huge source of grain trade for Europe. So it has a lot of chips in its own table, it has aces up its sleeve. So do you think, the way you understand Mr. Putin's leadership, that he is in expansionist mode, he wants to reassert global power, he may enter into war?
If you look at what President Putin has done in his own country from the time that he has taken over, that is the year 2000, Russia, I talked about it before, was in a state of collapse. It was on the verge of being a failed state. It had neither political coherence nor economic strength, and socially it was pulled apart by various disparate elements. What he has achieved, of course, with the help of high oil prices in the beginning, from the first 10 years of his rule, if you like, is a political coherence within the country, a unity within the country, and a strength which, despite all the other headwinds, has actually increased. Now, the projection of Putin as a reckless wrecker of the world order is something that is a creation of the Western media, because it has also suited the acrimony, the Russia-West acrimony at various points of time, the dismissive views about Russia. Famously, it has been called a gas station masquerading as a country. Putin has been called everything. If you're probably not old enough to remember Gabbar Singh in Sholay.
Of course, no Indian cannot know Gabbar.
So Putin is now the Gabbar Singh of the world. But if you look at it, he's a man who is driven by wanting to make Russia great. And you don't make Russia great by recklessly wandering into places where...
now, the moment you hear this phrase, it only evokes for the common people irrational leaders like Mr. Trump and others. So, the phrase itself speaks of maximalist leaders,
So what he has done so far is tried to get the best hand possible for Russia. And I would say, in fact, today, he's got his troops on the Ukrainian border. He is using them as a negotiating chip to get the best deal he can for a place for Russia in the European security architecture. If he really squanders this hand, Russia's place in the European security architecture is lost forever. Let's remember also, Putin has been ruling that country for 21 years. He's not going to rule the country for another 21 years. Whether it's the next 5 years or 10 years or whatever it is, it's a limited period that he's going to be in that country. Right. He also has his legacy to think about. And clearly, this is a legacy push that he's doing. He wants to have Russia integrated into Europe. And all he's trying to do is to see that he can do that. The moment he enters into a war, he has lost all these chips. And then you come to the second half of what you asked about sanctions. Sanctions, as you rightly said, have been imposed on Russia from 2014 onwards for a variety of offenses, transgressions that Russia is supposed to have made. Now, they have had only a limited impact on Russia's economy. They have retarded the growth of Russia's economy. They have not led Russia to collapse, as you can see. And as you rightly say, today, Russia is the world's second largest or largest exporter of oil, of gas. It is the world's largest exporter of wheat. It's not so well known, actually. And again, if you look at, and Ukraine, by the way, is the fifth largest. So therefore, if you have a war between Russia and Ukraine, the largest and the fifth largest together, you can imagine so war will create a problem, and sanctions will create a problem as well. They talked about cutting Russia out of the SWIFT system. If you cut Russia out of the SWIFT system, it can't sell gas to Europe. You said, actually, you already mentioned 3/4 of Europe's energy dependence is on Russia. That is 40% gas, some 25% oil, and the rest solid fuels, including coal.
Right.
So where does, sanctions can only hurt you, meaning the imposer of the sanction. They will hurt Russia. They may hurt Russia more. But is it a consolation to me that I'm hurting you more when I'm hurting also?
Right.
So sanctions also have a very limited applicability.
Right.
Therefore, actually both sides are caught in a cleft stick, as it were.
It's a crazy chess game.
You can keep threatening sanctions, but you know perfectly well that you don't want to impose those sanctions. They'll hurt you as well. And today, when gas prices are at sky high, inflation is going up. Even America, which is, again, if you look at it, the dependence of Europe on economic relations, on economic interaction with Russia is far greater than that of America. America's trade, when sanctions first hit Russia, America's trade with Russia was about $30 billion. Europe's trade with Russia was about $300 billion. Europe has taken a cut because of these sanctions from $300 billion. $300 billion. So Europe has taken a cut from $300 billion to something like $200 billion at that time, the first 2 years. Now, gradually, the trade is going up, investment is going up. So another round of sanctions will again hurt Europe very badly.
Right.
So all of these are, so both sides are sitting on tigers. That's why I said that both sides are sitting on tigers, and they have to find a face-saving way of getting off their tigers to get a solution.
Right. So I wanted to understand China's play in all this, because that also has massive implications for India. But before that, just one, because that's you said, not just popular perception of Putin, but the part which presents him as Gabbar Singh is also the way he's gone after all his opponents, and then even Nalwani and all the opponents who've been liquidated literally with poison and etc. chemicals. So what's your perspective on that? It may not be important in the geopolitical game, but is there that ruthless Gabbar Singh aspect of Mr. Putin?
See, certainly Mr. Putin is an authoritarian leader. I don't think there are any two ways about it.
Way of saying that, yeah.
However, he has also been elected. And while you can say that he has marginalized certain opponents, they also have their own perspective. He sees Navalny as somebody who's been propped up by the West and who's funded by the West in order to overthrow him. And therefore, he's very ruthlessly. However, even independent polling of Russia's political scene see Putin as the most popular leader in that country. His popularity is falling, but his popularity fell from something like 90% in 2014 to something like maybe 60% or 58% today, which is still, most leaders would be very proud of popularity ratings like that. So Russia has been run in a particularly authoritarian manner by every ruler it has had, from the Tsars to the communists to President Putin. And therefore, I'm not saying he's not an authoritarian leader. I would say, however, that some of these allegations that are made about what the authorities do in Russia are exaggerated. I mean, I keep seeing that, opposition leaders are killed every few days on the streets of Moscow. Well, I've lived in Moscow. Anybody who's lived in Russia will see that that is an exaggeration. But yes, it is authoritarian. Yes, it is single party. The Russians seem to like it. It is also a country of the size where you might argue that to keep that country of that size under control, especially when you see, as Putin does, I mean, you can argue about whether it's true or not, when you see that efforts are being made all along the periphery to unsettle Russia, to give Russia problems, then Putin feels that, and he has said so, by the way, that a strong central government is required because we face all these threats from our periphery. Everybody is trying to take us down. Everybody is trying to cut us down to size. The foreign hand, which is always a very useful excuse. Yeah. It's a very useful excuse. So it's a combination of all those things. But I'll come back to this, that when you're dealing with geopolitics, it is good to separate out the character of the ruler of the country from what you need from that country. So if I start worrying about how to make Russia into a democracy, then I lose my plot in geopolitics. So your moral judgment of how he runs his country and how he should run his country should be kept aside from how you want to deal with that country and how you want that country to behave. So I would make that distinction.
Yeah, that's an important one. I wish I was not speaking to you in this context because you have fascinating insights. I would have asked you about Masha Gessen's biography of him and the KGB mentality that probably he was birthed in and groomed in, but it's not the time to do that. It would
have that you see, that background has certainly helped him to control Russia. Especially at the time when he took over Russia, it was a collapsed state. It was a state which was completely in disarray. It was, as I said, it was a failing state. So you needed that background, perhaps you needed the kind of coterie that he collected around him in order to control. And the methods were not pretty. I mean, nobody is saying that the methods he used to bring his country into line were pretty. All I'm saying is that is not relevant to our consideration of where Russia is and what it's doing when we are sitting on the outside.
Right.
That is not relevant. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah, sure. So, sir, I wanted to understand your perspective on China. So there was this summit, the Mr. Putin summit, where, again, some interpreters are seeing that as a Sino-Russian axis, where they are declaring themselves as global powers. America has been looking very weak over the last few years and losing its hold. It's no longer a unipolar world. So people are seeing it as an axis, as a combination there. Others are reading it as that China is really hedging its bets because, again, China has massive trade relations with EU. It has huge trade relations with Russia. And Mr. Jinping is really weighing where he would land if there was war. And people are saying that it would suit him, actually, if Russia went to war, because then they would stop being the sole adversary of the US. But others are feeling that he may be hedging his bets. So how do you see it? Do you see a strong alliance there, or are they hedging their bets? And how will this all impact China?
The various points that you mentioned, I would say all of the above. But
all of them
all of the above, I said.
All of the above. Right.
Yeah, but no, see, actually, if you look at Russia and China, if you go back into history, have had a very acrimonious history. They've been strategic rivals. They've had huge border disputes among them. Large parts of what is today Siberia were actually with China until the 19th century, when what China calls an unequal treaty passed them over to Russia. And therefore, there has always been a certain amount of caution in Russia-China relations. What has, of course, on the other hand, there are also a lot of complementarities. They have a huge border. They have very complementary economic requirements. China wants the natural resources that Russia can supply in plenty. Russia wants the manufactured items that come from China. Military technologies, because in spite of all of what you say about Russian economy, Russia military technologies are still in certain niche areas very, very strong. We know that. We also buy it from them.
They are our biggest suppliers. Yeah.
So China is also keen on. So what happened? This is a relationship that after 2000, when they had settled their border disputes, flourished. But when Russia-US relations deteriorated rapidly, especially after 2014, the annexation of Crimea, Russia was faced with an effort to attempt to politically isolate it by the Americans and the West. Now, that naturally pushed it closer to China. And China was very happy to embrace Russia, because then some of the reserve that Russia had about giving latest military technologies to China or letting China into its strategic hydrocarbons industry and so on, some of it broke down out of necessity, because you needed the support, economic support and the political support of China, which is also a permanent member of the UN Security Council, which is very important, because that is where many of these battles play themselves out, as we saw last night as well about Ukraine. So, and the other side is China itself. China, it suits China perfectly well for Russia to be dependent on China for political and economic support. Then it bestrides the world stage as the sole counterpart to the US.
Right.
It puts Russia exactly where China wants it to be, which is what, as you said, the worsening of Russia's relations with the US suits China perfectly. What has happened, however, in the last part of the Trump administration and what the Biden administration, the US identifying China as its principal adversary, that has actually shaken China. And now, for the first time, China needs Russia almost as much as Russia needs China. All the more reason why, as you said, if Russia is bogged down, the US is bogged down with Russia in Europe, then it gives China more space to do what it wants to do in Asia, and to once again be a kind of a counterpart to the US. And obviously, as Biden's reason for wanting good relations with Russia is that he wants to free his energies to target China. To the extent that that doesn't happen, it's bad for us as well, because we want also we also want a US-Russia accommodation for two reasons. One is that leaves free US to deal with us in the Indo-Pacific, which is essentially a China move, and also it reduces American pressure on us to deal with Russia. Because the more acrimonious US-Russia relations are, the more we are under pressure from America to sort of or to create a space between us and Russia, and vice versa, which is not something that we would like to do.
Right. So, if you were to try and crystallize that, where do you think China currently stands? How would you read their declaration post their virtual summit?
Oh, no. See, this declaration is something, this is the kind of thing that happens all the time. Every time there is an acrimonious US-China meeting, Russia and China get together and declare how close they are to each other. Every time there is an acrimonious Russia-US meeting, or even a good US-Russia meeting, they meet. You see, here again, for both of them, they don't want to give up their demonstration of closeness until they know where they stand with the big power, which is the US.
Right.
So even if it is Russia, see, even if Russia is now responding to Biden, saying Putin is responding to Biden, saying that yes, we can have a modus vivendi, and that will help me sort of at least slightly create a distance from China. He doesn't want to do that until he's sure of this. So he is not going to start moving away from China until he's absolutely sure of where he stands with Europe. And even there's a limit to which they can move apart. I mean, it's not, it won't be visible, but at least the closeness will, in various subtle ways, it will loosen a little bit.
So is one ironic fallout of Mr. Putin's brinkmanship that it's in a way strength? Do you think that America has come out looking strong, again, leadership, over this whole Afghanistan drawback, the way they mishandled it, they've been seeming to lose power in the imagination, as they may have military power, but they've been losing their moral and imaginative hold on the world. But has this kind of strengthened their role as a leader of the world again? Are they handling it well according to you? Or is this again going to make America, is the EU now becoming its own player? How do you see America's role in all this?
Okay, there are three things in what you said, actually. One is America's withdrawal from Afghanistan left them looking weak and left them looking not the leader of the world.
Yeah.
Not the leader of the world. I would disagree with that. I would say that, that is a public perception. But that is not necessarily the perception among the strategic policy makers of the world. Essentially, what was America doing? Of course, the way they do it is the way Americans do these things. I mean, they're the superpower of the world. They don't have to bother about the feelings and
cleaning up their backyard at all.
And they don't have to bother about the feelings of their partners and allies and so on. America always does what it needs to do, and it does it the way it wants to do it. Everyone knows that, and this is not the first time. But it is not a sign of weakness. Essentially, it was President Biden saying, look, I don't want this war. This war has not got me anything. This war is not going to get me anything. So let the Afghan people do what they want to do, and let the others, the Russia and China and the others in the region, handle it. End of matter. It's basically a hard-headed thinking on the part of a superpower that I want to focus on other things. So, what was the other part? Sorry, I've lost track.
Yeah, I was asking whether there was an attrition in their leadership and whether this has bolstered.
What to make it look like? I think this drama which is going on about America saying Russia is going to do this and Russia putting more troops there. Now, how this resolves itself will determine how. That is why I said that both are sitting on tigers, because it is as much President Biden as President Putin who will come out of this either smelling of roses or otherwise. So if you have sorted out this issue in an amicable fashion, I think President Biden will be much better off both domestically and externally. And then there is a third issue, which is what is really causing all this, which is you talked about whether Europe will come out more independent. In fact, this whole episode, the other subtext of it is, where does Europe stand? You have this situation today where the US and Russia are arguing about what? They are arguing about security in Europe.
Yeah.
So, they're both of them, they're talking about Ukraine. Ukraine is not involved in it. They're talking about Europe. Europe is not directly involved in it, except through NATO. NATO is basically a US-led bloc. So they are talking now about Europe at some point of time. And this is what people are now, if you look at CNN, they tell you, Germany is now trying to break away from the NATO, is not exactly aligned with NATO thinking on this subject. President Macron is also, you say, stepping out of line. Now, the point also is that there comes a stage when Europe believes that it can also achieve a certain amount of strategic autonomy, create a little amount of distance between it and the US. And that is possible today. You see, during the Cold War, it was bound to the US because of this existential threat from the Soviet Union, because of the ideological threat from the Soviet Union. Now, communism is not there. Existential threat is not there. Europe is not the Europe of that time. NATO, I think you mentioned it. NATO, which is today 28 countries plus 2, US and Canada, 28 Europeans plus US and Canada, was actually 14 plus US and Canada at that stage. So Europe has spread in geography. It has a spread of political structures. there's no economic homogeneity there. So Europe now has to work out its own path, if you like, and that should also suit America. In the sense that America does not have to be the policeman of Europe anymore. America does not have to take responsibility for the defense of Europe. So arising out of this over a period of time, nothing happens tomorrow morning. Arising out of this over a period of time, that is what President Macron is saying, and that is what Chancellor Scholz will say, I think, soon, once he settles down more. Europe will look for a method by which it creates its own autonomy. In a sense, it will remain always allied to America, of course. But to a certain extent, they're talking about a European army, a European military force, Europe's capacity to act beyond its borders. Now, all of this is something that they tried in the year 2000. At that time, America was not inclined to let them go because at that time, the European theater was important. Today, America's gaze has shifted elsewhere. America would like to see Europe as a partner in dealing with the Indo-Pacific. So this may give Europe also a certain amount of autonomy, strategic autonomy, if it can sort out its own problems within itself, because it has a number of problems within itself because of its size and spread.
Right. So I'll just come to India before I ask you, if war breaks out, what scenario we foresee, apart from the terrible loss of lives. I wanted to understand that. But how do you see how India is playing this? Increasingly, it was seen as very close to America on so many defense issues, much more alliance. But India has been walking a fairly neutral path. It's been insisting on multiple alliances rather than non-alliance. So how do you read India's move in this, and how well are we playing this?
See, what India is doing is a natural consequence of the end of the Cold War. It was the Cold War that drove you to non-alignment, drove India to non-alignment. Within non-alignment is the concept of strategic autonomy. Strategic autonomy is basically doing what you think is best for you.
Right.
Now, we are no longer non-aligned, in spite of the fact that everyone keeps writing about non-aligned and NAM and so on and so forth. Our government has very clearly said India is not a non-aligned country anymore. We are members of NAM, which is a different thing altogether. Being member of a movement, a sort of multilateral organization doesn't necessarily mean you're... Anyway, so, and in today's world, when you have so many different kind of problems, it is not possible for you to be allied to one country or another. It is not possible. And our External Affairs Minister has a very good way of putting it. He says, we can have, what does he say, complementarity, but not congruence. We cannot have a congruence of interests. So if you look at it, you have the Chinese threat, if you like, or the Chinese challenge in the maritime region. That's why we do Quad, the Indo-Pacific initiatives, our relations with ASEAN, with the Bay of Bengal initiatives, etc., etc., etc. But we also have a continental flank, which is up north, which is where we are actually facing China across the border, and where you have Afghanistan, where you have Pakistan and Central Asia, and onwards.
So Quad we are with Australia, Japan, US, and India.
Yeah.
Then you have Israel, Middle East, UAE.
Oh, that's a different one.
We are part of SCO, which is the Shanghai Corporation. We are aligned with America. So it's interesting. I don't know about the continental flank.
So when I say continental flank, you look north. If you look up north, what do you see? That after all, the India's face-off with China is on the land border, not on the sea. So that is a continent. When I say continental flank, I mean that entire region north of India, northwest of India. If you look at Afghanistan, Central Asia, and you move further into the Caspian, Caucasus, and then up above you is Russia, and to the right of that is China.
Right.
So we are sandwiched there, and that is a region which is of great importance to us, and that's what I call the Eurasian flank, you can call it, or the continental flank. Now, we need to have relationships there. We need to be able to pursue our interests there. For that, you need Iran also, because since you can't go to Central Asia and Afghanistan through Pakistan, we need Iran to form that corridor. So we have this great deal of interest there, all of which are not necessarily served by our initiatives in the Quad or the Indo-Pacific. So that is what I mean. So you have to have relations, close relations, strategic partnerships with more than one player, and to pursue your interests with more than one player. In fact, you see, it has been said, you should treat today countries' relationships as a joint venture. So you have a joint venture where you have stakes in certain common interests within one joint venture, but it should not prevent you. It does not prevent you from having another joint venture as long as there's no conflict of interest. So the conflict of interest is as long as your core interests are not conflicting with each other. Therefore,
so that's an interesting point. So, as you said, so we've been fairly dexterous, though there's a lot of criticism of India's foreign policy right now and how we've cornered ourselves in many places. But this is not the conversation for that. I wanted to ask you in this context that is there not then a conflict of interest between one's close relationship with the US and their face-off with Russia? And it's not to our advantage to make Russia an enemy while we also have China as, we are both dependent on China as well as an adversary of China. So how do you think India is playing this particular crisis and this conflict of interest in the two JVs with Russia and US?
See, there should not be a conflict of interest. Actually, if you see, right now they are in this face-off. But even before that, Russia-US relations have been very acrimonious for many years now. 2014 onwards, in fact, since the annexation of Crimea.
Yeah. After Syria and the Middle East, all of that,
So, after the annexation of Crimea, this acrimony broke out and they're now facing each other through their proxies across the entire European and Asian periphery of Russia. And yet, we continued our relations with Russia. The Americans, in fact, asked us to join the sanctions that they imposed on Russia. We did not do so. See, the thing is that India's strategic partnership with America started flowering in the year 2000 onwards. And then we had this nuclear deal because of which America actually helped us get out of what we like to call nuclear apartheid. And the relations with the US have really blossomed very greatly. US today is our most important partnership. But one of the strategic underpinnings of the US-India partnership is, and if you go back to even Condoleezza Rice, who was the NSA of George W. Bush, is written in her memoirs, the US even then saw China as a rising power, and they saw India as a counterpoise, or democratic India as a counterpoise to China. And this is the reason why they said right from then onward that a strong India, militarily strong India in South Asia is in US interest, right? So if you today say that your India is 70% dependent on arms from Russia, if we today stop buying arms from Russia, we will have a military vulnerability that actually doesn't suit US purpose either.
Right.
So, this is an understanding, a strategic understanding that the US has had also, which is the reason why through all this period when their relations were very bad, while they kept talking about it and while they kept issuing threats to us, they never actually took any action to apply sanctions on us for our defense relations with Russia.
Right. So we bought these new missiles and things.
S-400, and you see, the US agrees, actually, I've had, as the chairman of the NSAB, I've had a lot of discussions with NATO people and US generals and so on. Everybody agrees that there is no system that NATO has today that they can sell us like this one. They also agree that this is a system that we need given our geography, our military requirements, and our terrain. So, being objective. And so most of the things that we read about is what the media talks about, what armchair foreign policy makers talk about. When you sit there making foreign policy, I think a lot of things are much clearer because you see how the world is actually running.
No, really. And like just now, just chatting with you, I hope our audiences get a sense of just what a complicated chess game this is, and probably Mr. Putin's greatest adversary, Gary Kasparov's brain is needed about how to play this game. So just finally to end, sir, this has been a wonderful masterclass that God forbid war actually breaks out. And like I asked you at the beginning, none of the Western forces are going to send their forces to Ukraine. how does that then, would Ukraine just be absolutely pulverized because they barely have any troops compared to, I think 9 million that Russia has? It's a superpower, it's a nuclear power. How is this? I mean, how would war pan out?
Yeah, of course, nuclear power should not be relevant here because I don't think Russia will use
That's not gonna,
They will
right.
not use nuclear power. Now, you're absolutely right. They've said, NATO has said many times that NATO troops will not fire on Russian troops. NATO will not enter Ukraine. NATO is not obliged to defend Ukraine under the terms of NATO. So I mean, this itself shows that war is a very low probability event, because what will you achieve with a war? What Russia can do is overrun parts of Donbass. Now, Donbass is already held by the separatists. Now, of course, it can claim that Ukrainian forces are attacking the separatists, so I'm defending the Donbass separatists. It can, according to what you see on CNN, various military experts talking about it, if you use your air force and if you use your long-range missiles, you can even reach Kiev. But what do you do reaching Kiev? You will create destruction. There will be a lot of destruction. There will be destruction of personnel of Ukraine, property of Ukraine, but also the Ukrainian army is not what it was in 2014. It will fight back. So there will be body bags going also back into Russia from
and
Ukraine.
like you said, there's a huge percentage of Russians in the eastern region. So you can't cherry pick who will be killed.
Hang on, there is also a very huge proportion of Ukrainians in Russia. You see, Ukraine and Russia have a very close cultural and ethnic link over centuries.
Yeah.
I
read somewhere that the first Russian state was created in Kiev.
Yeah, I was just going to say that. The first Slavic tribes, which eventually became the Russian nation, were based in Kiev. They were actually pushed out of there by the Mongol hordes which came across in the 13th century. They then went and took refuge in Moscow. And that is how Moscow became the capital of Russia. I mean, we're talking about many, many years ago. We're talking about 13th century.
Catherine.
No, well before Catherine.
For that, right.
Well before Catherine. So, yes, so that now, if you have ever lived in Russia, you will find that every third Russian you meet actually has a Ukrainian name. Or has relatives in Ukraine, father, grandfather, uncle, niece, nephew, whatever. So there is a very close cultural link. That's also there. So going into Ukraine will be for Mr. Putin a hugely unpopular exercise. And even autocrats are worried about their popularity.
Right.
So,
that brings me again, you talked about the media. Is this gamesmanship? Because actually President Zelensky as well as President Putin have repeatedly been saying that this is just, this talk of war, imminent war is absolute, pardon my language, bullshit, is what they've been saying, even the Ukrainian president, whereas the entire Western media has been saying war is imminent, America is saying that. So is that a conscious thing that America is doing to create an uncomfortable situation for Mr. Putin, or is it just, gauche misreading of the situation?
There is actually a conspiracy theory going around which may have some kernel of truth in it, which is that if you have to get this settlement between US and Russia, an important thing that you have to do is to get the Minsk Agreement implemented. And now, the US has said repeatedly, even yesterday in the Security Council, they said that they would support the Minsk agreements being implemented, which means France and Germany has to preside over this. The Ukrainian government is totally against implementation of the Minsk agreement. And it has domestically, it's very difficult for the Ukrainian government to sell to its people that it is surrendering. They see it as a partial surrender of sovereignty, even though it may not eventually be that. So this pressure and the pressure of Russian troops on the verge of attacking your country may make it easier to sell the Minsk agreement to the public. And that may be one of the reasons why this drumbeat of war, the hysteria is continuing. This is one of the conspiracy theories that is going around, I must say. But, to some extent, somewhere there is a logic in this. because the only way you can actually get this thing done is by implementing the Minsk Agreement in a way, in whichever way you can. Because the Minsk Agreement also, by the way, there is a lot of negotiating to be done, even when you sit down and start negotiating the Minsk Agreement. And the manner in which it is done will also have some impact. But this may be one of the reasons why there is so much shouting going on about this.
Talk of war.
Yes, yes.
Wow. Thank you very much, sir. It was fascinating for me, and I think really clarifies a lot of stuff beyond the big headlines that one is reading. So really, thank you for that experienced perspective on the issue.
Thank you very much. It's a great conversation. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, sir.
Thank you.